Well, hey, strangers. How have we all been keeping? I've missed you, and I'm very pleased to be back here today. But I do have a confession to make here at the top. While I've read The Lord of the Rings so many times that I've lost count, I've only read the Silmarillion like 3 times all the way through. I do enjoy it. I find pleasure within its pages. But the Silmarillion is not my favorite book of Tolkien's, like nowhere even close. That title belongs to Lord of the Rings, and I'm not even going to pretend that I don't know why. It's because the Silmarillion doesn't have any hobbits in it, and hobbits are my favorite. From when I was 9 years old, I was in like 4th grade, I think, I read The Hobbit, and I loved it. It scratched an itch I didn't know that I had. And it introduced me to other fantasy. Like, I started reading a lot of young adult fantasy, including the series of books by She Who Must Not Be Named. And when I was about 10 or so, my dad, who knew that I had read The Hobbit and enjoyed it, just came up and kind of pushed my Harry Potter book out of my eyeline and replaced it with Lord of the Rings. And so I tried to read Lord of the Rings, and I did not comprehend most of it, but I loved trying to read it. It satisfied me in a way that I didn't understand, like The Hobbit did, but more. I was so excited to be able to read more about Middle-earth and learn more about all of its peoples and creatures, hobbits in particular. I loved it. I didn't get it, but I was just so excited to be able to read it and feel like I was sitting on something. Like, I knew I had something special in my hands. I had never encountered anything like it, and I haven't since. And that's part of why it's my favorite book. When I read The Hobbit, Bilbo's my friend. That dude's my homie. Bilbo is a really good pal of mine, and Lord of the Rings has at least 4 times as many hobbits to get to know, so I was stoked. Like, hobbits whip ass. They know what's up. They know how to live. Like, the lifestyle, that's how I want to be. The sense of humor, the sense of goodness, the sense of just fierce friendship, and the eagerness to indulge in simple pleasures. Oh, that's truly the heart of all of this for me, is just pleasure. I don't think I'm alone in wanting some more of that in my day-to-day. Like, in the prologue of Lord of the Rings, we read that hobbits are perhaps so unwearyingly fond of good things, not least because they could, when put to it, do without them. That hit me hard when I was younger, and it hits just as sweet these days. Like, enjoy the good stuff while you have it and when you have it, because you might not always have it.
Oh my God.
To say that the concept of what a hobbit is, what hobbitry is, and what it means, to say that that had an influence on me would be an understatement, let's say. Valuing goodness and friendship and comfort and contentedness in simplicity, that's what I learned from hobbits, and that truly guides my worldview and how I try to move through the world. So it came as absolutely no surprise to me when I got older to learn that Tolkien himself also identified somewhat with hobbits, and today I want to talk about the hobbits and what they mean, both to the story and to Tolkien himself. We all know that old J.R.R. went crazy when he invented a little guy who runs around. He got up in the kitchen and he cooked up a meal for us. Tolkien's relationship to hobbits changed and evolved as he spent more time with them, and we're going to take a closer look at what they're doing here in The Lord of the Rings. Like, why are they here, these little guys who run around? So, come along. Grab your tall, shapeless felt bag that you call a hat, and let's trot out the door. So, to chat about hobbits, I feel it is pertinent to start at the very beginning with the Hobbit. The book is called The Hobbit because there was just the one, the Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins. And in The Hobbit, we see Bilbo kind of wrestling with the two sides of his nature, those being Took and Baggins. It's a major part of what makes him the Hobbit and of what makes the story interesting. This kind of like internal struggle between his more homebody tendencies and the dormant but more adventurous streak. Even on the very first page, Tolkien wastes no time in telling us what's up. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind, and people considered them very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. Hobbits in general are predictable folks. They're reliable, they're steady, and the Bagginses are clearly just particularly good hobbits. Like, they embody what a hobbit is. Tolkien continues to describe Bilbo. The mother of this hobbit, of Bilbo Baggins that is, was the famous Belladonna Took, one of the 3 remarkable daughters of the Old Took, head of the hobbits who lived across the water, the small river that ran at the foot of the hill. It was often said in other families that long ago one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. That was, of course, absurd, but certainly there was still something not entirely hobbit-like about them, and once in a while members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. They discreetly disappeared, and the family hushed it up. But the fact remained that the Tooks were not nearly as respectable as the Bagginses, though they were undoubtedly richer. This is the second page, and Bilbo's Took ancestry is being highlighted early on. We as readers are not quick to forget it. It comes up very often that Bilbo is at least half a Took, and that Tooks are kind of weird, and they're prone to disappearing and liable to have adventures. Again, in the very first chapter of The Hobbit, when the company of dwarves have made themselves at home in Bag End, they're singing a song, and as they sang, the Hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by hands and by cunning and by magic moving through him, a fierce and a jealous love, the desire of the hearts of dwarves. Then something Tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains, and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls, and explore the caves, and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. A little bit later on, Mr. Baggins turned the handle and went in. The Took side had won. He suddenly felt he would go without bed and breakfast to be thought fierce. There it is, like specifically the Tookishness in Bilbo that spurs him to adventure. The Baggins parts of him would very much prefer not to. They're happy to stay at home. But that spark, that something Tookish that was all up inside Bilbo, is very rare among hobbits, and it's what sets Bilbo apart and makes him the Hobbit. Tolkien's original conception of hobbits was essentially this. What's in this book. He wrote this one first. Hobbits are a humble and common folk who prefer to stay at home and live quiet lives without trouble. But there is that strange little streak, that kind of Tookish spark that shows up once in a while, and it's overwhelmingly strong. It drowns out the Baggins side of Bilbo almost immediately. Like, it takes almost nothing for him to be like, actually, I think I will go without bed and breakfast to be thought fierce. It's adorable, and it makes for an excellent adventure story. The Hobbit was a runaway success when it was published in 1937, so much so that Tolkien's publisher, Stanley Unwin, wrote to him in a letter that same year that a large public would be clamoring next year to hear more from you about hobbits. And to this, Tolkien responds, I am a little perturbed. I cannot think of anything more to say about hobbits. Mr. Baggins seems to have exhibited so fully both the Took and the Baggins side of their nature. But I have only too much to say, and much already written, about the world into which the Hobbit intruded. You can, of course, see any of it, and say what you like about it, if and when you wish. I should rather like an opinion, other than that of Mrs. C.S. Lewis and my children, whether it has any value in itself, or as a marketable commodity, apart from hobbits. But if it is true that The Hobbit has come to stay and more will be wanted, I will start the process of thought and try to get some idea of a theme drawn from this material for treatment in a similar style and for a similar audience, possibly including actual hobbits. From that alone, I don't think Tolkien ever initially intended to write more about hobbits beyond the one book, and it just so happened that that book proved so immediately popular that more was called for. In the late 1930s, there are plenty of letters from Tolkien describing his apprehension in continuing to write about hobbits. Again, to his publisher Stanley Unwin. I think it is plain that, quite apart from it, a sequel or successor to The Hobbit is called for. I promise to give this thought an attention, but I am sure you will sympathize when I say that the construction of elaborate and consistent mythology, and 2 languages, rather occupies the mind, and the Silmarils are in my heart. And what more can hobbits do? They can be comic, but their comedy is suburban, unless it is set against things more elemental. In 1938, Tolkien wrote in another letter, "The sequel to The Hobbit has remained where it stopped. It has lost my favor, and I have no idea what to do with it. For one thing, the original Hobbit was never intended to have a sequel. Bilbo remained very happy to the end of his days, and those were extraordinarily long. A sentence I find an almost insuperable obstacle to a satisfactory link. For another, nearly all the motives that I can use were packed into the original book, so that a sequel will appear either thinner or merely repetitional. For a third, I am personally immensely amused by hobbits as such, and can contemplate them eating and making their rather fatuous jokes indefinitely. But I find that is not the case with even my most devoted fans, such as Mr. Lewis and Rayner Unwin. Mr. Lewis says hobbits are only amusing when in unhobbit-like situations." So, from these letters he wrote, it's clear that Tolkien wanted to continue to work on and publish the Silmarillion. Like, he didn't think he could do or say anything else with the tale of the Hobbit and the characters it introduced. It's almost like the Hobbit was kind of a throwaway to him, and he was so preoccupied by the Silmarillion and its more consistent nomenclature and mythology that he did include elements of his Middle-earth workings in The Hobbit, but it wasn't originally intended to be part of the larger legendarium as such, I don't think. It was just supposed to be a story about The Hobbit, but people loved it. People loved The Hobbit, and they wanted more about hobbits, and so Tolkien was asked to write a sequel, and write he did, initially under much duress.
So basically, what I was thinking of was... Oh, fuck. I can't believe you've done this.
When Tolkien started to conceive of The Lord of the Rings, it was as a true sequel, similar in tone and structure to The Hobbit. Namely, a Baggins goes on an adventure. And at the start, that Baggins might have just been Bilbo again. An undated jotting from the History of Middle-earth reads, "Bilbo goes off with 3 Took nephews." And as Tolkien attempted to develop the sequel to The Hobbit, he drafted a long-expected party, the first chapter, over and over and over. As Christopher Tolkien states in the History of Middle-earth, the first chapter was itself reconstituted 3 times before the hobbits ever left Hobbiton, but the story then went all the way to Rivendell before the impulse failed. My father then started again, from the beginning, which he calls the second phase, and then again, the third phase. And as new narrative elements and new names and relations among the characters appeared, they were written into previous drafts at different times. So, Tolkien's like starting and going to a place and then stopping and starting again, and then writing some more and then stopping and then starting again. And then he is trying to kind of cross-reference his drafts by updating the new story elements into older drafts. It's all very confusing. Christopher Tolkien did an incredible amount of work with the History of Middle-earth. And he further says in the History of Middle-earth, "In the first draft, however, my father wrote that the story of the birthday party merely serves to explain that Bilbo Baggins got married and had many children, because I am going to tell you a story about one of his descendants. So, in the third version of the story, we get our first mention of Bilbo's son Bingo. And in the fourth version, Bingo becomes Bilbo's nephew and heir. Bingo. Can you get into that? Can you get into the name Bingo? Bingo Bulger Baggins, my dude. Ooh, the alliteration alone, delightful. I am very glad we didn't end up with Bingo, but it does make reading the history of Middle-earth extremely funny. Like, there's a clown character among us, his name is Bingo. But as you can guess, his son Bingo eventually becomes Frodo, our Baggins protagonist. So we have our Baggins, and the three Took nephews become several Took cousins, and they accompany Bingo on his adventure. We have Took and we have Baggins as manifestations of the duality of Hobbit nature as laid out by Tolkien in The Hobbit. Again, in his earliest conceptions of The Lord of the Rings, he draws this theme of the essential kind of nature of hobbits as Baggins and Tookish. He draws that into The Lord of the Rings as a main kind of guiding theme for the characters he's writing and the trajectory they'll eventually take in the final text. There's the adventurous aspect, and there's the homebody aspect. There's the remarkable, and there's the ordinary. And the Took cousins, they're there from the very first scribblings and drafts. Like, before Bingo shows up, the three Took cousins or three Took nephews are all there. That, to me, demonstrates how essential that sense of Tookishness, of like un-Hobbit-like adventurousness and curiosity and wonder for the wider world, is to an interesting story about hobbits. After all, hobbits are only interesting when in un-Hobbit-like situations, according to C.S. Lewis, and you've just got to get them out the front door to get them into a situation. Getting Lord of the Rings off the ground was a labor, as Christopher Tolkien writes in The History of Middle-earth. Immensely prolific as my father was, constantly revising, reusing, beginning again, but never throwing any of his writing away, his papers became inextricably complex, disorganized, and dispersed. This must be borne in mind throughout. The earliest drafts were put urgently to paper, just as the first words came to mind and before the thought dissolved, whereas the printed text inevitably conveys an air of calm and ordered composition, the phrasing weighed and intended. The first part of the story, before the ring left Rivendell, took by far the most labor to achieve. The first part of The Lord of the Rings is very much concerned with hobbits, and Tolkien spent a lot of time, at least 6 drafts, working out who his characters are and what they're doing here. And as he spent more time with his characters, and as the story developed and kind of got out of hand, he began to write more about his fondness for hobbits. In a 1947 letter, Tolkien writes, "It is precisely against the darkness of the world that comedy arises, and is best when that is not hidden. Evidently, I have managed to make the horror really horrible, and that is a great comfort, for every romance that takes things seriously must have a warp of fear and horror, if however remotely or representatively it is to resemble reality, and not be the merest escapism. But I have failed if it does not seem possible that mere mundane hobbits could cope with such things. I think that there is no horror conceivable that such creatures cannot surmount by grace, here appearing in mythological forms, combined with a refusal of their nature and reason at the last pinch to compromise or submit." This highlights something for me, and that's that lots of people, me included, are very much drawn to mere mundane hobbits as the grounding presence in an otherwise fanciful story. If you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you'll be swept off to, indeed. The hobbits are partially here to ground us, to put soil under the feet of high fantasy, as Tolkien says himself. Anyway, I myself saw the value of hobbits in putting earth under the feet of romance, and in providing subjects for ennoblement and heroes more praiseworthy than the professionals. Ennoblement. There's that word. The process of becoming noble. It emerges as a major theme for Tolkien when it comes to his hobbits. In a 1955 letter, Tolkien notes, "There are, of course, certain things and themes that move me specially. The interrelations between the noble and the simple, or common, or vulgar, for instance. The ennoblement of the ignoble I find specially moving." And then again, in another letter, this one written in 1956, Tolkien says, "The hobbits had been welcomed. I loved them myself, since I love the vulgar and simple as dearly as the noble, and nothing moves my heart beyond all the passions and heartbreaks of the world so much as ennoblement, from the ugly duckling to Frodo. I would build on the hobbits." And then one more, just from this very consistent period where Tolkien is writing a lot about his own writing. "I regard the tale of Arwen and Aragorn as the most important of the appendices. It is part of the essential story, and is only placed so because it could not be worked into the main narrative without destroying its structure, which is planned to be hobbito-centric. That is, primarily a study of the ennoblement, or sanctification, of the humble." The hobbits carry this theme that Tolkien just loves, and that's ennoblement, or elevation, or sanctification, the relationship between the noble and the simple. There's also a sense of grace and divine intervention that goes along with ennoblement. In a letter in 1965, Tolkien writes, "Hobbits were a breed of which the chief physical mark was their stature, and the chief characteristic of their temper was the almost total eradication of any dormant spark. Only about 1 per mil had any trace of it. Bilbo was specially selected by the authority and insight of Gandalf as abnormal. He had a good share of hobbit virtues, shrewd sense, generosity, patience, and fortitude, and also a strong spark yet unkindled. The story and its sequel are not about types or the cure of bourgeois smugness by wider experience, but about the achievements of specially graced and gifted individuals. I would say, if saying such things did not spoil what it tries to make explicit, by ordained individuals, inspired and guided by an emissary to ends beyond their individual education and enlargement." Bilbo was selected by the authority and insight of Gandalf, and he had that abnormal, dormant spark that is so essential to the whole thing. The tookishness in Bilbo is one of the ingredients to set ennoblement in motion, both for Bilbo himself and for the hobbits in The Lord of the Rings. This idea of specially graced and gifted individuals is important. The inspiration and guidance by an emissary to greater ends is equally so, so keep that in mind. Tolkien further expounds upon his hobbits. "We only meet exceptional hobbits in close companionship, those who had a grace or gift, a vision of beauty, and a reverence for things nobler than themselves, at war with their rustic self-satisfaction. The hobbits we meet are exceptional, remarkable, and graced with reverence for things higher and nobler." In another letter prior to the publication of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien writes, "In effect, The Hobbit is a study of simple ordinary man, neither artistic nor noble and heroic, but not without the undeveloped seeds of these things, against a high setting, and in fact, as a critic has perceived, the tone and style change with the Hobbit's development, passing from fairy tale to the noble and high, and relapsing with the return. The sequel, The Lord of the Rings, even in style, is to include the colloquialism and vulgarity of hobbits, poetry, and the highest style of prose. This last great tale, coming down from myth and legend to the earth, is seen mainly through the eyes of hobbits. It thus becomes, in fact, anthropocentric, but through hobbits, not men so-called, because the last tale is to exemplify most clearly a recurrent theme: the place in world politics of the unforeseen and unforeseeable acts of will and deeds of virtue of the apparently small, ungreat, and forgotten in the places of the wise and great, good as well as evil. A moral of the whole, after the primary symbolism of the ring is the will to mere power, seeking to make itself objective by physical force and mechanism, and so also inevitably by lies, is the obvious one, that without the high and noble, the simple and vulgar is utterly mean, and without the simple and ordinary, the noble and heroic is meaningless. So Tolkien marks here that even in the style, from colloquial vulgarity to the highest style of prose, it helps to highlight the process of ennoblement and how the simple and ordinary give meaning to the noble and heroic. One needs the other, otherwise they don't mean anything. Clearly, Tolkien's conception of nobility and ennoblement, or elevation or exaltation or sanctification, is set in connected opposition to mundanity, vulgarity, humbleness, commonness, and it's directly concerned with grace and divinity and virtue. In the interest of having a discussion, to further define nobility, we're going to turn to Dante and his Convivio. Yes, Dante, the Divine Comedy guy, the Inferno guy.
This Hermano guy.
He also wrote the Convivio, or the Banquet, which is essentially a series of lyrical poems followed by commentary on the poems. He discusses nobility and virtue as part of the commentary, and we're going to be looking at chapters 16 through 19 of Book 4 of the Convivio. The word nobility means the perfection of the nature proper to each thing. There are some fools, it is true, who believe the word noble means to be acclaimed and known by many, and they argue that it derives from a verb that signifies to know, namely nosco. This is utterly false, for if it were true, those things that were most acclaimed and best known of their kind would be the most noble of their kind. It is utterly false to say that noble comes from to know. It comes, rather, from non vila, and consequently, noble is the same as not base. So in this definition, nobility doesn't necessarily mean renown or acclaim, it simply means elevation or perfection, the perfection of the nature proper to each thing. Similarly, nobility does not mean highborn or of noble bloodline in Dante's definition. No one should think himself to be of nobility simply because he can say, I belong to her by race, if in fact these fruits are not in him. It provides an immediate explanation, saying that those who have this grace, namely this divine thing, are almost like gods untainted by vice. The divine seed does not fall upon a race, that is, family stock, but on individuals, and as will be proved below, family stock does not make individuals noble, although individuals make family stock noble. Essentially, just because you're born into a noble bloodline, that doesn't mean you're noble. You can bring nobility and honor to your bloodline or your house, but being born into a particular family, even if that family is considered noble, does not necessarily make you noble. And as part of his definition of nobility, Dante also discusses virtue as it relates to nobility, namely, that nobility is the cause and virtue is an effect. The base of a tree, which comprises all of its limbs, must be called the source and cause of them, and not they of it. Thus, nobility, which comprises every virtue as caused as effect, and many other of our praiseworthy activities as well, must be considered such that virtue is referred to it. Further, he says, nobility resides wherever virtue is. Nobility is the source of virtue, and virtue is an expression of nobility. Dante goes further here to say, nobility is present wherever there exists virtue, though virtue does not always exist wherever nobility is present. Nobility is a heaven in which many diverse stars shine forth. In her shine forth the intellectual and moral virtues, in her shine forth good dispositions conferred by nature, and praiseworthy emotions, for example modesty and mercy, and many others. So many are the stars that spread across the heavens that it surely cannot surprise us if many diverse fruits are produced by human nobility. So many are their natures and their powers, brought together and united in one simple substance, and on them, as on diverse branches, she bears fruit in diverse ways. Nobility takes many forms and expresses itself in many ways. Just as humans are individual and diverse, so nobility appears through diverse possibilities. Moral virtue, intellectual virtue, good disposition, praiseworthy emotions, these are all aspects of nobility in Dante's definition. So, what's all this? Like, why am I talking about Dante when this is ostensibly a discussion of Tolkien and hobbits? Well, firstly, I do know that Tolkien at least read Dante in a 1967 letter, which is Tolkien's response to an interview he did for The Telegraph magazine, in which he's quoted as saying, "Dante doesn't attract me. He's full of spite and malice. I don't care for his petty relations with petty people in petty cities." And Tolkien responds to his own quote here, saying, "My reference to Dante was outrageous. I do not seriously dream of being measured against Dante, a supreme poet. At one time, Lewis and I used to read him to one another. I was, for a while, a member of the Oxford Dante Society. I think at the proposal of Lewis, who overestimated greatly my scholarship in Dante or Italian generally." Beyond the fact that Tolkien has read Dante, I also find it, useful to call upon Dante here, because the Convivio is a self-reflective work in which Dante is providing commentary on his own work. In his letters, Tolkien provides a lot of commentary on his own work, especially Lord of the Rings. They're kind of like methodologically similar texts in this way, and I do find that they help one another out. Finally, Tolkien's conception of nobility has much to do with virtue and divinity, and so does Dante's. So, ultimately, the framework of nobility presented here by Dante is helpful when looking at the ennoblement of Tolkien's hobbits in The Lord of the Rings. Part of Dante's definition of nobility is simply not base, as opposed to well-known, and Tolkien views hobbits as base, common, mundane, a good starting point for ennoblement. Tolkien's idea of nobility is concerned with moral virtue, and Dante includes moral virtue in his definition of nobility. The moral virtues are more common, after all, and Tolkien's idea of ennoblement is concerned with the common as its subjects. The divine seed, or the grace that Dante mentions, falls on individuals like Frodo and like Sam, who Tolkien notes as ordained individuals. Alright, so now we're going to actually get into some good Hobbit stuff. And I just want to make a quick note here on the words vulgarity, mundanity, commonness. These words do not necessarily carry a negative connotation in this conversation here. They just mean everyday, simple, ordinary. And indeed, the way Tolkien describes Sam is why I don't associate these words with any sort of negative meaning in this context. We're going to take a quick look at a significant passage from Return of the King, during which Sam has the ring. This is in the Tower of Cirith Ungol chapter. His thought turned to the ring, but there was no comfort there, only dread and danger. No sooner had he come in sight of Mount Doom, burning far away, than he was aware of a change in his burden. As it drew near the great furnaces where, in the deeps of time, it had been shaped and forged, the ring's power grew, and it became more fell, untamable save by some mighty will. As Sam stood there, even though the ring was not on him, but hanging by its chain about his neck, he felt himself enlarged, as if he were robed in a huge, distorted shadow of himself, a vast and ominous threat halted upon the walls of Mordor. He felt that he had from now on only two choices: to forbear the ring, though it would torment him, or to claim it and challenge the power that sat in its dark hold beyond the Valley of Shadows. Already the ring tempted him, gnawing at his will and reason. Wild fantasies arose in his mind, and he saw Samwise the Strong, hero of the age, striding with a flaming sword across the darkened land, and armies flocking to his call as he marched to the overthrow of Barad-dûr. And then all the clouds rolled away, and the white sun shone, and at his command the Vale of Golgoroth became a garden of flowers and trees and brought forth fruit. He had only to put on the ring and claim it for his own, and all this could be. In that hour of trial, it was the love of his master that helped most to hold him firm. But also, deep down in him lived still unconquered his plain hobbit sense. He knew in the core of his heart that he was not large enough to bear such a burden, even if some visions were not a mere cheat to betray him. The one small garden of a free gardener was all his need and due, not a garden swollen to a realm. His own hands to use, not the hands of others to command. The vision that Sam sees shows him renown without virtue, a sort of false nobility, and Sam demonstrates his true virtue and his good hobbit sense immediately, restating his humbleness and contentment in plain terms. His own hands to use, not the hands of others to command. And Tolkien has a lot to say himself about Sam in particular. In one of his letters, Tolkien writes that Sam is meant to be lovable and laughable. Some readers he irritates and even infuriates. I can well understand it. All hobbits at times affect me in the same way, though I remain very fond of them. But Sam can be very trying. He is a more representative hobbit than any others that we have to see much of, and he has consequently a stronger ingredient of that quality which even some hobbits found at times hard to bear, a vulgarity, by which I do not mean a mere down-to-earthiness. A mental myopia which is proud of itself, a smugness in varying degrees and cocksureness, and a readiness to measure and sum up all things from a limited experience, largely enshrined in sententious traditional wisdom. We only meet exceptional hobbits in close companionship, those who had a grace or gift, a vision of beauty, and a reverence for things nobler than themselves, at war with their rustic self-satisfaction. Imagine Sam without his education by Bilbo and his fascination with things elvish. Not difficult. The Cotton family and the Gaffer, when the travelers return, are a sufficient glimpse. I did repeat part of that passage earlier in the video to highlight that the hobbits we meet, those with grace, with a vision of beauty, and a reverence for things nobler than themselves, they're all what I'm calling pupils of Bilbo, right? Like Frodo certainly is, being Bilbo's heir and having learned Elvish from him. And Bilbo also taught Sam his letters, meaning no harm, mind you, and instilled in him some of this grace, this vision of beauty. Hence, Sam's obsession and excitement about elves. Without his education by Bilbo, Sam is just a regular-ass hobbit, like standard issue, regular-degular hobbit type. If not for the influence of Bilbo and of Frodo, Sam's rustic self-satisfaction, or the Baggins side of his nature, would win out. And when I say the Baggins side, obviously I know Sam is a Gamgee, he's not a Baggins, but in terms of the duality of Hobbit nature as laid out by Tolkien in The Hobbit and in the initial drafts of The Lord of the Rings, there's that kind of divide between the Tookish side of things and the Baggins side of things, and regular-degular hobbits err on the Baggins side of things, as discussed earlier. To return to that same letter from Tolkien, he continues, Sam was cocksure and deep down a little conceited, but his conceit had been transformed by his devotion to Frodo. He did not think of himself as heroic or even brave or in any way admirable, except in his service and loyalty to his master. Sam's humbleness proves a virtue. He does not see himself as heroic or admirable except in his service to Frodo. But Sam is heroic and brave and admirable during the quest and after. After the ring has been destroyed and the hobbits return to the Shire, they find that it's occupied by Saruman, or Sharky. And this is a little bit of a long passage that I'm about to read, but I think it's important. So this is in Return of the King, the Grey Havens chapter, speaking about the destruction of the Shire at the hands of Sharky. The trees were the worst loss and damage, for at Sharky's bidding they had been cut down recklessly far and wide over the Shire, and Sam grieved over this more than anything else. For one thing, this hurt would take long to heal, and only his great-grandchildren, he thought, would see the Shire as it ought to be. Then suddenly, one day, for he had been too busy for weeks to give a thought to his adventures, he remembered the gift of Galadriel. He brought the box out and showed it to the other travelers, for so they were now called by everyone, and asked their advice. "I wondered when you would think of it," said Frodo. "Open it." Inside it was filled with a gray dust, soft and fine, in the middle of which was a seed, like a small nut with a silver shale. "What can I do with this?" said Sam. "Throw it in the air on a breezy day and let it do its work," said Pippin. "On what?" said Sam. "Choose one spot as a nursery, and see what happens to the plants there," said Merry. "But I'm sure the lady would not like me to keep it all for my own garden, now so many folk have suffered," said Sam. "Use all the wits and knowledge you have of your own, Sam," said Frodo, "and then use the gift to help your work and better it, and use it sparingly. There is not much here, and I expect every grain has a value." So Sam planted saplings in all the places where specially beautiful or beloved trees had been destroyed, and he put a grain of the precious dust in the soil at the root of each. He went up and down the Shire in this labor, but if he paid special attention to Hobbiton and Bywater, no one blamed him. And at the end he found that he still had a little of the dust left, so he went to the 3-farthing stone, which is as near the center of the Shire as no matter, and cast it in the air with his blessing. The little silver nut he planted in the party field, where the tree had once been, and he wondered what would come of it. All through the winter he remained as patient as he could, and tried to restrain himself from going round constantly to see if anything was happening. Spring surpassed his wildest hopes. His trees began to sprout and grow as if time was in a hurry and wished to make 1 year do for 20. In the party field, a beautiful young sapling leaped up. It had silver bark and long leaves and burst into golden flowers in April. It was indeed a Malorn, and it was the wonder of the neighborhood. In after years, as it grew in grace and beauty, it was known far and wide, and people would come long journeys to see it, the only Malorn west of the mountains and east of the sea, and one of the finest in the world. Altogether, 1420 in the Shire was a marvelous year. Not only was there wonderful sunshine and delicious rain, in due time and in perfect measure, but there seemed something more, an air of richness and growth, and a gleam of a beauty beyond that of mortal summers that flicker and pass upon this middle earth. All the children born or begotten in that year, and there were many, were fair to see and strong, and most of them had rich golden hair that had before been rare among hobbits. The fruit was so plentiful that young hobbits very nearly bathed in strawberries and cream, and later they sat on the lawns under the plum trees and ate until they had made piles of stones like small pyramids or the heaped skulls of a conqueror, and then they moved on. And no one was ill, and everyone was pleased, except those who had to mow the grass. Sam did that. Sam essentially single-handedly Johnny Appleseed jump-started the rehabilitation, recovery, and beautiful renewal of the Shire. To return to the history of Middle-earth for just a quick moment, the Scouring of the Shire, ending in the last battle ever fought there, occupies a chapter. It is followed by a second spring, a marvelous restoration and enhancement of beauty, chiefly wrought by Sam with the help of gifts given to him in Lorien. But Frodo cannot be healed. For the preservation of the Shire he has sacrificed himself, even in health, and has no heart to enjoy it. Sam has to choose between love of master and of wife. In the end, he goes with Frodo on a last journey. It's Sam who does the saving. He can't save Frodo, but he can follow him, and so he does, highlighting another important aspect of Sam's character. And to return again to Tolkien's correspondence, Sam is the most closely drawn character, the successor to Bilbo of the first book, the genuine hobbit. Frodo is not so interesting because he has to be high-minded and has, as it were, a vocation. The book will probably end up with Sam. Frodo will naturally become too ennobled and rarefied by the achievement of the great quest, and will pass west with all the great figures, but Sam will settle down to the Shire and gardens and inns. C. Williams, who is reading it all, says the great thing is that its center is not in strife and war and heroism, though they are understood and depicted, but in freedom, peace, ordinary life, and good liking. And this, I think, relates to another letter that I will just read from very quickly here. I think the simple rustic love of Sam and his Rosie, nowhere elaborated, is absolutely essential to the study of his, the chief hero's character, and to the theme of the relation of ordinary life, breathing, eating, working, begetting, and quests, sacrifice, causes, and the longing for elves and sheer beauty. It is that ordinary life, the one with breathing and eating and working and fucking, that belongs to hobbits like Sam. His perfection is in his commonness, and he actualizes the pinnacle of hobbitness in the Shire with his family, his environmental efforts, and his time in office. The full expression of his kind of down-home hobbit sense is his nobility. Like, it's the source of all of the other virtues that make Sam the hero of the story. And Samwise is, by far and away, Tolkien's favorite hobbit, if that passage I just read isn't enough of an indication. It's my estimation that he's Tolkien's favorite. He's at least the hero of the story. And he embodies that which Tolkien finds charming and important, that vulgarity, that commonness, that smugness and content that makes Sam a perfect subject for ennoblement. His virtue lies in his simplicity and his love for his home, and also in his loyalty to his master. A perfect subject for elevation to the position of hero, and again, this is where his ennoblement lies. From simple gardener to the hero of the story, the ring-bearer strong enough to resist and relinquish the ring. Sam briefly carries the ring in Mordor, as we read about earlier, and he's still able to see through its seductive powers, and he gives it back to Frodo. Like, his faithfulness to his own good hobbit sense makes his ennoblement possible, and when he returns to the Shire, he plays a huge part in its recovery from Sharky's occupation. And he's elected mayor 7 times over, and he has a large family with his hot wife, he has 13 children, to carry on his legacy. And finally, before Sam follows Frodo to the Undying Lands, he passes the Red Book to his descendants, further securing his place in history and cementing his ennoblement. Poor Frodo, man. Oh, this poor guy. While Sam's ennoblement is concerned with the virtue of humbleness, Frodo's ennoblement takes on a rather different form in Tolkien's estimation. Frodo, knowing that he is not at all up to the task, accepts the ring and the quest anyway. He very nearly completes the task appointed to him, but he falls at the final hurdle. And we're going to take another look at Return of the King real quick, this time at Mount Doom. The light sprang up again, and there on the brink of the chasm, at the very crack of doom, stood Frodo, black against the glare, tense, erect, but still, as if he had been turned to stone. "Master!" cried Sam. Then Frodo stirred and spoke with a clear voice, indeed with a voice clearer and more powerful than Sam had ever heard him use, and it rose above the throb and turmoil of Mount Doom, ringing in the roof and walls. "I have come," he said, "but I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine." And suddenly, as he set it on his finger, he vanished from Sam's sight. Here, Frodo is no longer himself. He speaks in a voice that is not his own, and he cannot destroy the ring. He is utterly overtaken and consumed by it. It's only when Gollum bites his finger off and falls into the fire that Frodo is freed of his burden, involuntarily and violently. So technically, Frodo failed, and Tolkien has a lot to say about it. After The Lord of the Rings was published, Tolkien received a lot of letters about Frodo and his failure as the hero, and Tolkien responded in kind, as was his way. I find it useful to quote Tolkien's own words here, so please humor me as I read from a few of his letters that directly concern Frodo's failure and how Tolkien sees it. It became at last quite clear that Frodo, after all that had happened, would be incapable of voluntarily destroying the ring. Reflecting on the solution after it was arrived at as a mere event, I feel that it is central to the whole theory of true nobility and heroism that is presented. Frodo indeed failed as a hero, but I do not think Frodo's was a moral failure. At the last moment, the pressure of the ring would reach its maximum. Impossible, I should have said, for anyone to resist, certainly after long possession, months of increasing torment, and when starved and exhausted. Frodo had done what he could and spent himself completely as an instrument of providence, and had produced a situation in which the object of his quest could be achieved. His humility, with which he began, and his sufferings were justly rewarded by the highest honor, and his exercise of patience and mercy towards Gollum gained him mercy. His failure was redressed. We are finite creatures with absolute limitations upon the powers of our soul-body structure in either action or endurance. Moral failure can only be asserted, I think, when a man's effort or endurance falls short of his limits, and the blame decreases as that limit is closer approached. Nonetheless, I think it can be observed in history and experience that some individuals seem to be placed in sacrificial positions, situations or tasks that for perfection of solution demand powers beyond their utmost limits, even beyond all possible limits for an incarnate creature in a physical world, in which a body may be destroyed, or so maimed that it affects the mind and will. Judgment upon any such case should then depend on the motives and disposition with which he started out, and should weigh his actions against the utmost possibility of his powers, all along the road to whatever proved the breaking point. Frodo undertook his quest out of love, to save the world he knew from disaster at its own expense if he could, and also in complete humility, acknowledging that he was wholly inadequate to the task. His real contract was only to do what he could, to try to find a way, and to go as far on the road as his strength of mind and body allowed. He did that. I do not myself see that the breaking of his mind and will under demonic pressure after torment was any more a moral failure than the breaking of his body would have been. So in that letter, there's a lot going on from Tolkien, but as we unpack this passage, the role of divinity and grace in Tolkien's conception of nobility becomes very clear. Frodo is placed in a sacrificial position as an instrument of providence, and he is perfect for that role. His perfection, according to his nature as an instrument of providence, and his expression of the virtues that spring forth from his nobility, are expanded upon by Tolkien in his other letters. And here I'm going to read several in a row, as they're all related and important when looking to understand Tolkien's themes and his interpretation of his own work. So, please bear with me. The quest was bound to fail as a piece of world plan, and also was bound to end in disaster as the story of humble Frodo's development to the noble, his sanctification. Fail it would and did as far as Frodo considered alone was concerned. At this point, the salvation of the world and Frodo's own salvation is achieved by his previous pity and forgiveness of injury. At any point, any prudent person would have told Frodo that Gollum would certainly betray him, and could rob him in the end. To pity him, to forbear to kill him, was a piece of folly, or a mystical belief in the ultimate value in itself of pity and generosity, even if disastrous in the world of time. He did rob him and injure him in the end, but by a grace, that last betrayal was at a precise juncture when the final evil deed was the most beneficial thing anyone could have done for Frodo. By a situation created by his forgiveness, he was saved himself and relieved of his burden. If you reread all the passages dealing with Frodo and the ring, I think you will see that not only was it quite impossible for him to surrender the ring, in act or will, especially at its point of maximum power, but that this failure was adumbrated from far back. He was honored because he had accepted the burden voluntarily, and had then done all that was within his utmost physical and mental strength to do so. He and the cause were saved by mercy, by the supreme value and efficacy of pity and forgiveness of injury. Frodo failed. It is possible that once the ring was destroyed, he had little recollection of the last scene, but one must face the fact The power of evil in the world is not finally resistible by incarnate creatures, however good, and the writer of the story is not one of us. By chance, I have just had another letter regarding the failure of Frodo. Very few seem even to have observed it, but following the logic of the plot, it was clearly inevitable as an event, and surely it is a more significant and real event than a mere fairy story ending in which the hero is indomitable. It is possible for the good, even the saintly, to be subjected to a power of evil which is too great for them to overcome in themselves. In this case, the cause, not the hero, was triumphant, because by the exercise of pity, mercy, and forgiveness of injury, a situation was produced in which all was redressed and disaster averted. Gandalf certainly foresaw this. Of course, he did not mean to say that one must be merciful, for it may prove useful later. It would not then be mercy or pity, which are only truly present when contrary to prudence, not ours to plan. But we are assured that we must be ourselves extravagantly generous if we are to hope for the extravagant generosity which the slightest easing of, or escape from, the consequences of our own follies and errors represents. And that mercy does sometimes occur in this life. Frodo deserved all honor because he spent every drop of his power of will and body, and that was just sufficient to bring him to the destined point, and no further. Few others, possibly no others of his time, would have got so far. Frodo is bound to his quest, right? And the quest is bound to fail, in the sense that he will be utterly destroyed by it. Like, there is no back again for Frodo. He goes there. His body comes back, but his soul does not. He is utterly consumed and destroyed by the quest. He is the only one who could have done it, and he is not up to it. Evil is not resistible by incarnate creatures, and indeed, this evil, the ring, was too great for Frodo to ultimately overcome. He knows he's not up to the task, but he does it anyway. He knows that nobody else can do it, and so he must. Even while being tortured and driven mad by the ring, he maintains his virtues of pity and mercy. And as Tolkien notes there, it's not like Gandalf told him, like, dog, you better be merciful, you better show pity to others. No, Frodo has free will. He's a humble guy, and he practices pity and mercy because he feels in his heart that it's the right thing to do. And that's what makes him noble. His failure and his ennoblement are inextricably intertwined in Tolkien's view. He gave absolutely all of himself to the quest, spent every drop of his power of will and body, and no other could have done what he did. Frodo could barely do what he did, and he was ordained and specially graced to complete the task appointed to him. Though he failed at the final hurdle, the task was still completed, again due only to his mercy and pity for Gollum. If Gollum had not lived to confront Frodo at Mount Doom, he would not have bitten off Frodo's finger and freed him of his burden. He would not have fallen with the ring into the flames. It was Frodo's pity and mercy that spared Gollum, and thus ensured the completion of the quest. And it is the expression of these virtues that indicates Frodo's nobility. Frodo sacrifices himself to save the Shire, to save Middle-earth, and thus he is sanctified. The journey ruins him. It fucks up his whole situation, and he can never really go home or feel at peace in Middle-earth ever again. He gave up the thing he was fighting for so that others could have it instead, and that's peace. These virtues of pity and of mercy are divinely given to Frodo. Remember Tolkien's note about the achievements of specially graced and gifted individuals, ordained individuals inspired and guided by an emissary to ends beyond their individual education and enlargement? The emissary, in this case, if it's not obvious, is Gandalf. And Gandalf is the earthly manifestation of Olorin, who is a pupil of Nienna. And Nienna is the Vala most associated with mourning, pity, grief, and endurance of spirit. It's a pretty direct connection. Nienna taught Gandalf these virtues, and Gandalf lives them and practices them and passes them along to Frodo. And so Frodo is a morally virtuous individual, specially graced by the Maya, and according to Dante, where there exists virtue, there must exist nobility, and Frodo is noble indeed. He is perfect according to Hobbit nature, reluctant and stubborn and generous and kind. In his imperfection, he is perfect. It bears repeating that no one else could have done what he did. His self-sacrifice is his Hobbit nature in its final form. Like, that's his final evolution, is the Frodo who's reluctantly accepting the ring, choosing to go on the quest, knowing that he's not gonna make it, and trying anyway, and completely destroying himself in the process in the hope that he might save his home. That's the perfection of Hobbit nature expressed to the fullest right there. And Tolkien kind of echoes this in another one of his letters. Frodo is a study of a hobbit broken by a burden of fear and horror, broken down and in the end made into something quite different. None of the hobbits come out of it in pure Shire fashion. They wouldn't. But you have got Samwise Gamgee. And I think that's a lovely little excerpt because it kind of places Sam and Frodo at odds with one another. Frodo does not come out of the journey in Shire fashion, but Sam kind of sort of does. Like, we can still cling to Sam if we want to get an idea of how a hobbit can bear a ring of power and still find peace. Hobbit nature is like very involved in all of this for me. Like, Sam's good hobbit sense and Frodo's good hobbit will are what ultimately get the job done. And for their role in getting the job done, in destroying the ring and saving Middle-earth, Frodo and Sam are awarded the highest honors in the land, and later given the opportunity to sail to the Undying Lands as mortal beings. They can finally rest and recover and heal and find peace before succumbing to the final impermanence of their mortality. So after the ring is destroyed, Frodo and Sam rest and recover as much as they can, and then they are kind of brought to a wooded area full of folks to celebrate them. And this is from the Field of Cormallen in The Return of the King. Oh, just one other note real quick. There is a song or poem in here, and Tolkien offers a translated version of it in one of his letters, and I'm gonna read the translated version because it's in English. So just note that what's in the book is not necessarily what I'm reading, because I'm reading the translation. As the hobbits approached, swords were unsheathed, and spears were shaken, and horns and trumpets sang, and men cried with many voices and in many tongues. Long live the halflings! Praise them with great praise. May the halflings live long. Glory to the halflings. Praise them with great praise. Frodo and Samwise. Frodo and Sam, princes of the West. Glorify them. Praise them. Glorify them. Bless them. Bless them. Long we will praise them. Praise them. The ring bearers, bless or praise them to the height. Praise them, the ring bearers, praise them with great praise. Oh my god, I feel like I'm at church. And so, the red blood blushing in their faces and their eyes shining with wonder, Frodo and Sam went forward and saw that amidst the clamorous host were set 3 high seats built of green turves. Behind the seat upon the right floated, white on green, a great horse running free. Upon the left was a banner, silver upon blue, a ship swan-proud faring on the sea. But behind the highest throne, in the midst of all, a great standard was spread in the breeze, and there a white tree flowered upon a sable field beneath a shining crown and 7 glittering stars. On the throne sat a mail-clad man, a great sword was laid across his knees, but he wore no helm. As they drew near, he rose, and then they knew him, changed as he was, so high and glad of face, kingly, lord of men, dark-haired with eyes of grey. Frodo ran to meet him, and Sam followed close behind. "Well, if this isn't the crown of all," he said. "Strider, or I'm still asleep." "Yes, Sam, Strider," said Aragorn. "It is a long way, is it not, from Bree, where you did not like the look of me? A long way for us all, but yours has been the darkest road." And then to Sam's surprise and utter confusion, he bowed his knee before them, and taking them by the hand, Frodo upon his right and Sam upon his left, he led them to the throne, and, setting them upon it, he turned to the men and captains who stood by and spoke, so that his voice rang over all the host, crying, "Praise them with great praise." And it's lovely for many reasons, among them being the kind of churchly, praise them with great praise, glorify them, bless them, long may we praise them. It's all very evangelical in mode and tone. And then Frodo and Sam meet Aragorn, and he literally places them upon the throne, like they are to be the highest lauded. It's not Aragorn, it's Frodo and Sam. And after all of this, a minstrel sings a song about them, immortalizing their deeds in the oral tradition of Middle-earth. Like all great tales have a song to share, and Frodo and Sam, of a race relatively unknown to most of Middle-earth until very recently, are now part of its historical tapestry. They're recognized for the large part their small hands played in its saving. Nobility is not renown, but nobility drove the actions that led to their renown, and the salvation of Middle-earth makes evident the ennoblement of Frodo and Sam. But wait
a minute!
Let's return to Dante for just a moment. Nobility is a heaven in which many diverse stars shine forth. In her shine forth the intellectual and moral virtues. In her shine forth good dispositions conferred by nature, and praiseworthy emotions, for example, modesty and mercy and many others. So many are the stars that spread across the heavens that surely it cannot surprise us if many diverse fruits are produced by human nobility. So many are their natures and their powers brought together and united in one simple substance. And on them, as on diverse branches, she bears fruit in diverse ways. Frodo and Sam do indeed demonstrate different fruits of nobility, but there are two other entire hobbits here to consider. There are two other subjects of ennoblement putting earth under the feet of high fantasy, and Tolkien doesn't really speak directly about them at all in his published correspondence, not the way he does with Frodo and Sam. And that, conveniently, leaves plenty of room for me to talk about it instead. I hope you wanted a twist, because this video series is not about Frodo and Sam at all.
Gotcha.
I needed to understand Tolkien's conception of nobility and ennoblement, and he expresses this through commentary on Frodo and Sam, so I have spent some time with them here, but this isn't about them. It's about the Hobbit PR team, baby. Psych. Fucking got your ass. It's Merry and Pippin time. Strap in. We're doing it. Hey Mackenzie, you might be asking, why aren't you going deeper into divinity as it relates to spirituality, and specifically Tolkien's spirituality? Why aren't you talking more about the Valar and the possibility of their involvement in Frodo's ordainment? You can expand on Frodo and Sam here with more than just a couple of quotes from the final book, so why not do that?
No off-topic questions, because I don't want to. No, permission denied. That's an off-topic questions. Next, you have been stopped.
Because I can come back to all of that. Right now, I want to talk about my boys. Life is short, and I'm trying to have a good time. And that's what Merry and Pippin are all about. Dog! Sam and Frodo fill that kind of main Hobbit Bilbo role, but Merry and Pippin are also here. They are two entire other hobbits who have their own storylines and their own shit going on.
I got stuff going on you don't know about.
It is their nature as characters, their function in the story of putting soil under the feet of high fantasy, in giving us someone to relate to, that Merry and Pippin find their salient purpose, for me anyway. Their virtue is in being regular dudes who just really love their best friend and want to help him out by any means necessary. Like, Frodo and Sam are ordained, and Merry and Pippin are also chosen by Gandalf, but only after they've joined the quest of their own volition. Sam and Frodo have to be here. Merry and Pippin choose to be here. Before Frodo ever leaves the Shire, Merry and Pippin tell him that they're going with him. He literally is given no other choice in the matter. They're his friends, and they're going with him. When they've reached Rivendell, and after the Council of Elrond, Elrond chooses the members of the Fellowship. He gets like a good 7 going, but in Fellowship of the Ring goes south. There remain 2 more to be found, said Elrond. These I will consider. Of my household I may find some that it seems good to me to send. But that will leave no place for us, cried Pippin in dismay. We don't want to be left behind. We want to go with Frodo. That is because you do not understand and cannot imagine what lies ahead, said Elrond. Neither does Frodo, said Gandalf, unexpectedly supporting Pippin. Nor do any of us see clearly. It is true that if these hobbits understood the danger, they would not dare to go, but they would still wish to go, or wish that they dared, and be shamed and unhappy. I think, Elrond, that in this matter it would be well to trust rather to their friendship than to great wisdom. Even if you chose for us an elf lord, such as Glorfindel, he could not storm the Dark Tower, nor open the road to the fire by the power that is in him. You speak gravely, said Elrond, but I am in doubt. The Shire, I forebode, is not free now from peril, and these 2 I had thought to send back there as messengers, to do what they could, according to the fashion of their country, to warn the people of their danger. In any case, I judge that the younger of these 2, Peregrine Took, should remain. My heart is against his going. Then, Master Elrond, you will have to lock me in prison, or send me home tied in a sack, said Pippin, for otherwise I shall follow the company. Let it be so, then. You shall go, said Elrond, and he sighed. Now the tale of 9 is filled. In 7 days the company must depart. In that passage, Gandalf highlights friendship as the reason that Merry and Pippin need to be part of the Fellowship, and the enduring friendship of Merry and Pippin, both to one another and to Frodo, their cousin, is one of the many virtues that expresses their nobility. And also, the fact that Gandalf persuaded Elrond to let Merry and Pippin go along on the journey comes up over and over. It's like its own sort of providence and grace. I have a few examples of this real quick. There are plenty more, and we'll be getting into it. Trust and believe. But for the purpose of this conversation, I think it's important to highlight a couple of these. One of which is in the 2 Towers in the Riders of Rohan chapter. Charpter? Yeah, you heard me. Aragorn and his companions searched far and wide about the field of battle, but the light faded and evening soon drew down, dim and misty. By nightfall they had discovered no trace of Merry and Pippin. We can do no more, said Gimli sadly. We have been set many riddles since we came to Tol Brandir, but this is the hardest to unravel. I would guess that the burned bones of the hobbits are now mingled with the orcs. It will be hard news for Frodo if he lives to hear it, and hard too for the old hobbit who waits in Rivendell. Elrond was against their coming. But Gandalf was not, said Legolas. But Gandalf chose to come himself, and he was the first to be lost, answered Gimli. His foresight failed him. The Council of Gandalf was not founded on foreknowledge of safety, for himself or for others, said Aragorn. There are some things that it is better to begin than to refuse, even though the end may be dark. So there in that passage, Gimli's like, you know, Elrond really didn't want them to come, and now they're dead, and that's a huge bummer. And Aragorn's like, bop, 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 bop. Like, hold up. Like, Gandalf does have a bit of foresight, but even if he cannot see all ends, it doesn't mean he made a bad call by having these 2 little bros come along with us. Hold your horses, and maybe hold my horse while I look for tracks on the ground. Thank you. Further along in the 2 Towers, in the Palantir chapter, this is after Pippin has looked into the evil bowling ball, and Gandalf is kind of like chatting with Aragorn, talking about what had happened. And he says, "At this time, we have been strangely fortunate. Maybe I have been saved by this hobbit from a grave blunder. I had considered whether or not to probe this stone myself to find its uses. Had I done so, I should have been revealed to him myself. I am not ready for such a trial, if indeed I shall ever be so. But even if I found the power to withdraw myself, it would be disastrous for him to see me yet, until the hour comes when secrecy will avail no longer." "That hour is now come, I think," said Aragorn. "Not yet," said Gandalf. "There remains a short while of doubt which we must use. The enemy, it is clear, thought that the stone was an Orthanc. Why should he not? And that therefore the hobbit was captive there, driven to look in the glass for his torment by Saruman. That dark mind will be filled now with the voice and face of the hobbit and with expectation. It may take some time before he learns his error. We must snatch that time." Even though Gandalf is pissed off at Pippin because he looked at the Palantir and definitely should not have done all that, he's like, well, maybe it's a good thing because now I don't have to look in it. Sauron won't be seeing me. He'll be seeing that little fucking guy and his little face and hearing his little voice and thinking he might be the halfling that everyone's talking about who's carrying the ring, and he's clearly with Saruman at Orthanc because that's where the stone is. Why would it be anywhere else? So Gandalf essentially is like, Pippin has created for us a perfect diversion and distraction completely by accident, and yet it still is. So that's kind of where I find that providence and grace for Pippin in the story is through little passages like that, and also for Merry, but Pippin's the one who does all the bowling ball action, so in that passage it's Pippin focused. One more, just real quick. This is in Return of the King, after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. This is in the Houses of Healing chapter, after Pippin has found Merry kind of wandering shell-shocked in Minas Tirith, and Pippin sends word. He's like, yo, please go find me a Gandalf or an Aragorn. Please get someone to come help us. And then it was not long before Gandalf himself came in search of them. He stooped over Merry and caressed his brow. Then he lifted him carefully. "He should have been born in honor to this city," he said. "He has well repaid my trust. For if Elrond had not yielded to me, neither of you would have set out, and then far more grievous would the evils of this day have been." Which again is just a note of Merry helped kill the Witch King. If Elrond hadn't let Merry and Pippin come along on the journey, Merry wouldn't have been able to stab the Witch King in the back of the knee and weaken him so that Éowyn could finish him off. Sliding doors. Anything could have happened, but it ends up being a pretty good deal for everyone that Merry and Pippin were allowed to come. So, as I've gone over several times now, for Tolkien, ennoblement happens to specially graced and gifted individuals ordained by an emissary. Gandalf did insist on Merry and Pippin joining the quest, and it turns out, several times over, to be a really, really good thing that he did. He chose them originally because he knew that their friendship with Frodo would keep them going to the bitter end. So I have one more quick little passage to read here. This again from Fellowship of the Ring. The breaking of the Fellowship. This is when Frodo and Boromir are off having a tiff, and the rest of the Fellowship is near the river, kind of chatting about what happens now. Aragorn says, "If you would let me choose, then I should appoint 3 companions. Sam, who could not bear it otherwise, and Gimli and myself. Boromir will return to his own city, where his father and his people need him, and with him the others should go, or at least Meriadoc and Peregrine, if Legolas is not willing to leave us." "That won't do at all," cried Merry. "We can't leave Frodo. Pippin and I always intended to go wherever he went, and we still do. But we did not realize what that would mean. It seemed different so far away, in the Shire or in Rivendell. It would be mad and cruel to let Frodo go to Mordor. Why can't we stop him?" "We must stop him," said Pippin, "and that is what he is worrying about, I'm sure. He knows we shan't agree to his going east, and he doesn't like to ask anyone to go with him, poor old fellow. Imagine it, going off to Mordor alone." Pippin shuddered. "But the dear silly old hobbit, he ought to know that he hasn't got to ask. He ought to know that if we can't stop him, we shan't leave him. A perfect example and encapsulation of the friendship of Merry and Pippin, where they're like, whoa, 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 like, we're in way over our heads and we know that. We had no idea what we were in for, but we're still not turning back. We don't want to separate from Frodo. We said we would go with him. We love him very much. We're going with him. Like, there's no further discussion to be had. There's nothing else to say here. We're going. So in terms of Merry and Pippin being included on the quest, it also doesn't hurt that Gandalf has a fondness for hobbits, and Tooks in particular, and he likes having them around when it comes to adventuring. Merry and Pippin adventure voluntarily and relatively easily. I think it's fair to say that they each have a little spark of that Tookishness in them. Like, they go tramping about the Shire with Frodo and all that. And that adventurous streak is, again, what drives any interesting story about hobbits. You need to get them out the front door, you know? That's part of their nature, that, like, little Tookish streak. It's literally in their blood. Merry and Pippin are both directly related to the old Took, just like Bilbo is. Merry's mother is a Took, the sister of Pippin's dad, and Pippin is full Took by name, blood, and inheritance. By adventuring, they both perfectly express their Tookish nature, and it does not take a wizard coming knocking and telling them, bud, you gotta go, you gotta get on the road. They're like, oh, Frodo's going? Then we're going. That's our bro. That spirit of Tookishness, again, is kind of what drives their involvement, at least initially, and their friendship with Frodo is what continues to drive their involvement. But stick with me here, just real quick. If fantasy is escapism, as Tolkien says in that famous quote of his about being imprisoned and wanting to escape, isn't going out of the front door part of escapism? Isn't picking up a book to get immersed in it a sort of going out the front door in a way? I draw a pretty simple connection between Tookishness and the impulse to escape, explore, and adventure, which is the impetus behind works like The Lord of the Rings. Without that spirit of Tookishness and that little spark, none of the hobbits go anywhere, and none of this ever happens. So, I've laid a lot of groundwork here, and that was all in an effort to highlight the aspects of the story that directly concern Merry and Pippin. The putting of soil under the feet of high fantasy romance, the essential spirit of Tookishness that drives Hobbit adventure stories, the relation of virtue and nobility to perfection in the nature of a thing, and the grace of being chosen by Gandalf. Let's again return to Dante's definition of nobility here. The word nobility means the perfection of the nature proper to each thing. It is predicated not only of man, but also of all things, for a stone, plant, horse, or falcon is called noble whenever perfection is perceived in its nature. In general, this word, namely nobility, means in all things perfection of their own nature. So basically, a noble thing is a thing that is perfect according to its own nature. And to me, Merry and Pippin are absolutely perfect examples of the nature and virtue of hobbits as laid out by Tolkien, the guy who invented hobbits. I also, and this is like a me thing, having been a participant in and observer of the Tolkien fandom for several decades now, I get the general impression that Merry and Pippin fall by the wayside a little bit. We'll get into it in the next couple of videos, but there's a lot of focus on Frodo and Sam, and Merry and Pippin also have a huge role to play in the quest and in the story as a whole, and their ennoblement and nobility is multifold for me. These boys are part of the very fabric of the story, and within the story itself, they are significant figures. Most non-Hobbit characters who encounter hobbits in the story, they're not meeting Frodo or Sam. They're meeting Merry and or Pippin. These boys are representing for their kin across Middle-earth. They are the Hobbit PR team. That's why I call them that. Like, what they bring to the story is very special, and we're gonna get into it in the next 2 videos. I'm first going to talk about Merry Oddock Brandybuck, where he came from, what his deal is, the role he has to play in the story, and his perfection according to his nature. And then I'm going to talk about Pippin, my favorite character, Peregrine Took, his origins, his immaculate vibes, his contributions to the success of the Quest of the Ring, and how he embodies the nobility and virtue of hobbits. I am so fucking excited. I'm so excited. I've been sitting on this for a long time. It has taken me a while to figure out how to put all of this into words. This is a feeling I carry in my heart, and I'm doing my best to express it. So thank you for joining me. Are you ready? I'm ready. Let's go.
Right. Where are we going?
What the fuck, Richard?
All right, bro.
Thank you, bro. Thank you.